The Hebrew name Jeremiah may mean the Lord exalts or the Lord establishes. This is fitting, as he was one of the few individuals in the Bible mentioned as being set apart by God before his birth for a special mission and purpose. He was born in the small city of Anatot, the son of a priest, but his destiny would take him far from that quiet life, placing him in the path of kings and in the center of a dying nation. His story is one of incredible resilience and heartbreaking sorrow. Join us as we explore the life of this remarkable prophet. Beloved, I ask for the help of all of you. To help me produce more videos, please subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. And if you like this video, please leave that like, which helps me a lot. Anatot was a quiet place. It was a city of priests, resting in the hills of the land of Benjamin, only a few kilometers northeast of the great bustling city of Jerusalem. The air in Anatot was often filled with the scent of barley and figs, and the days passed with the familiar rhythms of prayer and observance. Here, a young man named Jeremiah grew up in the house of his father Hilkiah. Hilkiah was one of the priests, and Jeremiah was raised in a home that feared God and honored the ancient traditions. His childhood occurred in a tumultuous time, but his home was a place of peace, in touch with the religious tradition of his people. Yet, even in the quiet of Anatot, a shadow from the capital city stretched long and cold. Jeremiah was a thoughtful young man, more prone to walking in the fields alone than joining the loud games of other boys. He possessed a heart that felt things deeply, perhaps too deeply for the world he lived in. When he traveled with his father to Jerusalem, he did not see the glory of the kingdom, he saw the cracks in its foundation. He saw the social injustice, the way the rich ignored the poor, and the way righteousness was for sale in the city gates. He heard the whispers of pagan practices, of idols hidden in homes, and secret rituals performed in the high places. The nation's heart was divided. They spoke of the Lord in the temple, but gave their true devotion to things made of wood and stone, to gods that demanded nothing and offered only illusions. This spiritual neglect, this slow turning away from the true religion, settled in Jeremiah's own heart, not as rebellion, but as a deep, profound sorrow. He was the son of a priest, a child of the covenant, yet he felt a growing unease, a sadness he could not yet name. He watched the people, and his spirit ached for them. He was a priest in training, but he was already weeping for the people on the inside. Long before he had a public ministry, he just did not understand why. He was a part of the southern kingdom of Judah, but he felt like a stranger in his own land. The call did not come as a shout from the heavens. It did not arrive in a flash of lightning or the rumble of an earthquake. It came to Jeremiah as a deep, certain knowledge, a voice that spoke not to his ears, but to the very center of his being. The Lord spoke to him, the words forming in his mind with perfect clarity. "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart." Jeremiah was struck with a cold wave of fear. The words were too large for him, too heavy. He was a young man from a small city, accustomed to the quiet life of a priest's son. The thought of being set apart, of being special, terrified him. The voice continued, and the mission was defined. "I appointed you as a prophet to the nations." Nations, the word echoed in his mind. Not just Anatot, not just Jerusalem, but the nations. He looked at his own hands, the hands of a young man, not the calloused hands of a prophet hardened by the wilderness. He felt completely inadequate for the responsibility. He answered the voice, his own thoughts sounding small and weak. "Ah, sovereign Lord, I do not know how to speak. I am only a child." It was true. He felt like a child, small and unready, standing before an impossible task. He was not a great orator. He was not a brave soldier. He was just Jeremiah. But the voice was not angry at his hesitation. It was firm and it was reassuring. "Do not say, 'I am only a child.' You must go to everyone I send you to and say whatever I command you. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you and will rescue you." Then, a sensation. The Lord reached out his hand and touched Jeremiah's mouth. It was not a physical touch, but a feeling of warmth and purpose, a divine reassurance that sealed his call. "I have put my words in your mouth," the voice said. "See, today I appoint you over nations and kingdoms to uproot and tear down, to destroy and overthrow, to build and to plant." The unease that had followed Jeremiah for all his life finally had a name. The sorrow he felt for his people was not his own creation. It was a reflection of God's own heart. His sadness was not a weakness. It was the beginning of his purpose, a heavy and holy burden. The priest's son from Anatot was now a prophet, and his life and the life of his nation would never be the same. The 13th year of King Josiah's reign arrived like a new dawn, a period of profound optimism that spread through the streets of Jerusalem and into the surrounding towns. It was the year 627 BC. Jeremiah, still a young man, felt the weight of his divine appointment. The words of God, to uproot and tear down, to build and to plant, were a constant echo in his mind. He had been called to this purpose, but as he looked around, he saw a kingdom that was already in the process of rebuilding itself. King Josiah was one of the most righteous kings Judah had ever known. He was not a man who tolerated the decay that his predecessors had allowed. Under his command, a wave of reforms was sweeping the nation. The high places, where pagan rituals had dishonored the land, were being torn down. The idols that had cluttered the corners of homes and public squares were being broken apart. The temple itself was being purified, its purpose restored. For the first time in a long time, the nation was turning its face back toward the God of their fathers. Into this hopeful atmosphere, Jeremiah began his ministry. He watched the outward changes and allowed himself to feel a fragile, tentative hope. Perhaps his calling was not as terrible as he had first feared. Perhaps the king's righteousness would be enough. Perhaps the people's hearts would truly change, and his role would be to build upon this new, pure foundation. He wanted to believe it. He wanted more than anything for his people to be saved. He began to preach, and at first his words seemed to align with the king's reforms. He spoke of a true return, of a heart loyal to God. He supported the king's actions, but his divine insight, the burden that had been with him since childhood, would not let him rest. He saw a danger that the king's reforms could not touch. He saw that the people were compliant but not converted. They were breaking their idols with their hands, but not with their hearts. He walked through the markets of Jerusalem, the same markets he had visited as a child, and he saw that the social injustice remained. It was quieter now, more cleverly hidden, but it was still there. The powerful still found ways to take advantage of the weak. The courts still favored the wealthy. The return to pagan practices had been suppressed, but it had not been extinguished. It waited, like embers under the ash, for a new wind to give it life. Jeremiah's sorrow deepened. He was torn. He respected King Josiah. He honored the man's devotion and his courage. Yet the message God had given him, the words that had been placed in his mouth, began to diverge from the national mood of celebration. He could not just be a voice of encouragement. He had to be a voice of truth. He began to warn them. He spoke in the city gates and in the temple courts, his voice ringing with an urgency that baffled the optimistic crowds. He warned that a physical reform was not enough. He pleaded with them to change their hearts, not just their habits. He warned that obedience out of fear of the king was not the same as obedience out of love for God. The reaction was immediate and cold. The people, who had been praised for their reforms, did not want to hear that their reforms were hollow. The priests, who were enjoying their restored status, did not want to hear that their rituals were empty. They looked at this young prophet from Anatot with confusion and then with annoyance. Was he not on the king's side? Was he not happy that the idols were gone? This was Jeremiah's first true taste of persecution. It was not yet the pit, not yet the stocks, but it was the sharp sting of ridicule. He was called a pessimist. He was labeled a gloomy discourager, a man who could only see the bad. The chapter of his life that began in the 13th year of King Josiah was not the hopeful beginning he had prayed for. It was the beginning of his isolation. He stood as a lone voice, watching his nation paint the outside of a house that was rotting from within. He was a prophet of the Old Covenant, but God had given him the heart of the New, a heart that knew that only an internal, spiritual change could save them. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled his bones, that this change was not happening. The fragile hope that had defined the reign of King Josiah was shattered, not by a slow decay, but by a sudden, brutal blow. The world stage was shifting. Great empires were on the move. Babylon, a shadow from the north, was growing in power, and the old alliances were breaking apart. King Josiah, in an attempt to navigate these dangerous political currents, went out to battle. He did not return. The righteous king, the great reformer, the last hope of his generation, passed away on the battlefield. When the news reached Jerusalem, a wave of shock and disbelief paralyzed the city. But no one felt the loss more acutely than Jeremiah. The prophet's sorrow was profound. The Bible records that when Josiah died, Jeremiah bitterly lamented him. This was not merely the required grief for a fallen monarch. This was a raw, personal agony. Jeremiah wept for the man he had respected, the good king who had tried to steer the nation back to God. But he also wept for what he knew was to come. He knew that Josiah had been the only thing holding back the darkness. He was the finger in the dam, and now he was gone. The unraveling was immediate. The reforms that Josiah had spent his life building simply crumbled. They were a house of cards, and his death was the gust of wind that leveled them. Before the period of official mourning had even concluded, the true heart of the people was revealed. The idols that had been hidden in cellars and buried in back rooms were brought out. The pagan practices which had been whispered in secret were now shouted in the streets. The high places that had been torn down were rebuilt, this time with a defiant energy. The people, released from the restraint of their righteous king, rushed back to their old ways with a frightening enthusiasm. The political situation devolved just as quickly. The period of the last 5 kings of Judah began, a tragic succession of unjust men who would preside over the kingdom's final days. After Josiah, 4 unjust kings ruled. The first was Jehoahaz, who was put on the throne, but his reign was short. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the nation followed him gleefully. He was quickly followed by Jehoiakim, and then Jehoiachin, and finally Zedekiah. Each was worse than the last. Each one solidified the nation's path to ruin. For Jeremiah, everything changed. His ministry, which had been a difficult warning during a time of peace, was now a desperate plea during a time of collapse. The period of about 40 years that his ministry would span was now entering its darkest phase. The ridicule he had faced under Josiah transformed into open hostility under the new, unjust kings. His message was no longer a gentle caution. It became a terrible, specific warning. He warned of an imminent disaster. He named the enemy, Babylon, the power from the north. He prophesied that they would come, that they would be the instrument of God's judgment, and that Jerusalem and its temple would be destroyed. This was a message no one wanted to hear. He was no longer just a pessimist, he was a traitor. He was accused of weakening the morale of the people, of speaking against the king and against the temple. But Jeremiah could not be silent. His brief, fragile hope for a peaceful reform was gone, replaced by the fiery certainty of judgment. The good king was dead. The evil kings were ruling. And the weeping prophet, his heart broken by the death of his king and the spiritual corruption of his people, stood alone to face the long, dark years that were to come. The weight of the new kings, and the impossible speed with which the people abandoned their reforms, settled upon Jeremiah. He felt adrift. His warnings, once tempered by the hope of King Josiah's righteousness, now felt like hollow echoes in a nation determined to run toward its own ruin. He felt confused, lost in the purpose God had given him. He had been told to uproot and tear down, but also to build and to plant. Where was the building? All he could see was decay. In this moment of profound despair, feeling inadequate and unheard, the word of the Lord came to him again, not in a grand vision, but as a simple, quiet instruction. Go down to the potter's house, and there I will give you my message. It was a strange command. The potter's house was not in the clean priestly quarters of the city. It was down in the lower districts, a place of industry and earth, of fire and sweat. Jeremiah obeyed. He left the temple courts, with their cold rituals and mocking whispers, and began the long walk down the city's winding streets. The air grew thick with the smell of smoke from kilns and the dust of the valley. He found the small, unassuming workshop, a simple shed open to the street, and he stood in the doorway, watching. A man, his hands and arms caked in brown clay, sat at his station. He was working intently at 2 stone wheels, one beneath his feet and one at his hands. With a rhythmic kick, he spun the lower wheel, which turned the upper wheel in a steady, mesmerizing motion. On top of the wheel was a lump of wet, dark clay. Jeremiah watched as the potter centered the lump, his hands steady and sure. Then, as the wheel spun, the potter pressed his thumbs into the center of the clay, and as if by magic, the walls of a vessel began to rise. The potter's hands were gentle but firm, shaping the spinning earth into a jar, a vessel. It was an ancient, quiet art, a perfect picture of creation. Jeremiah watched, transfixed. The potter was almost finished. The vessel was tall and looked useful. Then, suddenly, the potter stopped his feet. He had found a flaw. Perhaps there was a stone in the clay, or an air bubble, or perhaps he had simply applied pressure in the wrong way. The vessel was marred in his hand. It was flawed, unbalanced, and unusable. A wave of disappointment washed over Jeremiah. It felt like a painful metaphor for Judah, a nation created, shaped, and almost brought to completion, but now hopelessly flawed. But the potter did not seem angry. He did not sigh. And most importantly, he did not take the flawed, slumped clay and discard it. He did not throw it out into the street to be trodden underfoot. Instead, with one powerful, decisive motion, he crushed the ruined vessel in his hand. He folded the clay back in on itself, pushing it down until it was once again just a formless lump on the wheel. He added a little more water, and with a kick of his foot, he began the process again. His hands, still steady, still sure, began to work the same lump of clay. He centered it, he pressed his thumbs into it, and the walls began to rise once more. This time, there was no flaw. The clay responded. He shaped it into a new vessel, a beautiful and strong container, as it seemed good to the potter to make. Jeremiah stood motionless, the profound silence of the workshop broken only by the sound of the spinning wheel and the potter's breathing. In that moment, the word of the Lord filled his mind, as clear and as present as the potter before him. The analogy was complete, and its truth was devastating and beautiful all at once. God spoke to him. "O house of Israel, can I not do with you as this potter does? Look, as the clay is in the potter's hand, so are you in my hand." He was the potter, the nation was the clay. The people had no right to demand anything, no right to question the Maker. If the vessel became flawed, impure, and useless, the potter had the absolute sovereign right to do as he pleased. He could reshape it. And that reshaping, Jeremiah now understood, might look and feel like destruction. It might feel like being crushed, like being reduced from a proud nation back to a formless lump, but it was not abandonment. It was the necessary, painful, and loving act of a master craftsman who refused to discard his creation. He was a God who specialized in making things new. Jeremiah turned from the shop, the smell of the wet clay and the fire in his nostrils. He now had his message. It was a parable of two parts, a terrible warning and a hope that was almost too painful to believe. Jeremiah returned from the potter's house with a new fire in his heart and a new parable on his lips. He did not go to the king's court, where his words were already considered treason. He went back to the people, to the temple courts, to the city gates, to any place where the men and women of Judah gathered. He waited until a crowd was present, and he began to preach the first of the two great lessons he had learned in the dusty workshop. It was the lesson of their condition. He cried out, "The Lord commanded me to go to the potter's house, and there he showed me the truth. He showed me what we are. We are the clay." The people looked at him, confused. This was not the fire and brimstone they were used to, but Jeremiah's message was just as intense. "The first lesson is this," he shouted. "We need to know that we are fragile." He looked at the proud people around him. He saw merchants who trusted in their wealth, soldiers who trusted in their spears, and priests who trusted in the routines of the temple. He moved to dismantle their pride, piece by piece. "First," he said, "we must know that we are fragile in our bodies. God created us from the dust of the ground. We are nothing but earth, animated by His breath. Our lives are a vapor." This was a truth no one could deny. "But more than this," he continued, his voice rising, "we are fragile in the moral field. We are living in dark and chaotic days. We live in days of relativism," the crowd murmured. This was a new and uncomfortable idea. You have abandoned the law of God, the ancient paths, the parameters that give life structure and safety. Every man does what is right in his own eyes. You say, "I will follow my own heart. I will decide my own truth." You think this is freedom, but it is not. It is the chaos of clay without a potter. It is a lump that cannot hold its shape. He looked into their eyes and spoke of the consequence. "This generates anguish. You feel it, do you not? The emptiness in the midst of your festivals, the fear that gnaws at you when you are alone at night. Human beings need parameters. We need the strong and loving hands of the potter to give us form. Without that form, we are just mud, and this pursuit of doing what you want leads only to despair and confusion." Then Jeremiah's voice grew softer, filled with the sorrow that had earned him his name. "Finally, and most dangerously, we are spiritually fragile. We can say that we believe. We can come to the temple. We can offer the sacrifices. But our belief is not as strong as we should want. It is a mile wide and an inch deep. We say, 'Lord, Lord,' with our mouths, but our hearts are far from Him. Many times we falter." He pointed toward the temple. "When the good King Josiah was alive, you followed the reforms. You tore down the idols because the king commanded it. But the moment he was gone, the moment your faith was truly tested, you faltered. You ran back to your idols, back to your secret sins, back to your alliances with foreign powers. You trust in the stone walls of Jerusalem. You trust in the armies of Egypt. You trust in everything except the living God." He let the heavy truth hang in the air. This is our state. This is the clay. We are physically fragile, morally lost, and spiritually shallow. The vessel is marred. It is flawed and unusable. He looked at the angry and offended faces in the crowd. They did not want to be called fragile. They did not want to be called flawed. They were the chosen people, the citizens of the great city, of the great king. But Jeremiah had to give them the first lesson in its entirety, no matter how much it hurt. They had to understand their own brokenness before they could ever understand the potter's grace. They had to know that a vessel so deeply flawed could not be patched or repaired. It had to be broken down completely. The crowd was tense. They had heard the first lesson, the heavy news of their own fragility. They began to mutter against Jeremiah, calling him a bearer of bad news, a man who loved to tear down. But before they could disperse, before their anger could silence him, Jeremiah raised his voice once more, and this time it was not filled with warning, but with a desperate, passionate plea. "You have heard the first lesson," he cried. "You have heard the warning, but you have not heard the second lesson. You have not heard the hope. You have not understood the heart of the potter." He leaned forward, his eyes scanning the faces of the people, begging them to listen. "When I was at the potter's house," he said, his voice dropping slightly, "when I saw the clay become marred in his hand, what did he do? Did he curse the clay? Did he sigh with frustration and throw it away? Did he discard it and wash his hands of the work? No, he did not. He entrusted himself to his work. His specialty is making and remaking. He immediately collapsed the flawed vessel and began again. And this is the second lesson, O Judah. We need to trust in the Lord's faithfulness. Our God," Jeremiah proclaimed, "is a master potter. His specialty is making vessels of honor. He is not a careless craftsman. He is not a lazy worker who gives up at the first sign of a flaw. He does not create things just to destroy them. He works according to his will and his love. And his will is to make you into something beautiful and strong." A few people in the crowd paused. This was not what they expected. This was not the message of doom they associated with Jeremiah. "God has control of all things," Jeremiah continued. "This is a truth that should give you great comfort. He has control of the nations. He has control of the armies from the north. He has control of the wicked kings who sit on the throne. And he has control of this flawed clay that is our nation. Nothing that is happening is a surprise to him. Therefore," he said, building to his final, most important point, "we need to surrender to his action. That is the only way. Do not be so reluctant. Do not be so stubborn." He balled his fist to demonstrate. Hard, dry clay cannot be molded. Stiff clay resists the potter's hand. And when the potter presses, that hard clay can only do one thing. It shatters. It breaks. He looked at them with tears in his eyes. "Do not be so reluctant. Do not stiffen your necks as your fathers did. Soften your hearts. We must be willing to let God mold us, to let him do his work, even when the molding feels like crushing. We must surrender to his action." He painted for them the two paths that lay before the nation. If we remain hard, he warned, if we trust in our walls and our armies and our own wisdom, the potter's hand will come. And because we are hard, we will be shattered into 1,000 pieces. This is the destruction I have warned you about. This is the exile. This is the end of Jerusalem as we know it. But, he offered, his voice full of a desperate hope, there is another way. If we soften our hearts, if we repent and surrender to his will, the potter's hand will still come. He must still deal with the flaw. The vessel must still be reshaped. It will still be painful, but it will not be shattering. It will be molding. It will be a remaking. This was the profound hope hidden inside the prophecy of doom. The exile, the captivity, the terrible suffering he saw coming, it was not a final execution. It was the potter's wheel. It was the necessary, painful, and powerful act of God crushing the flawed vessel in his loving hand, not to destroy it, but to make a new vessel. He will make us vessels of honor, Jeremiah whispered. He will make a new covenant, not on stone, but on our hearts. He will remake us. But we must be willing. We must be soft clay. We must trust the potter." He finished speaking. The crowd was silent, digesting the immensity of what he had said. He had offered them hope, but it was a hope that required them to first admit their brokenness and then to surrender their control. It was a message of trust that, in their arrogance, they mistook for a message of weakness. Some walked away thoughtful, but most walked away angry, labeling him a traitor who wanted them to surrender. Jeremiah was left standing alone, having delivered the potter's full message, a message of trust that the people were too fragile and too proud to accept. The parable of the potter, which Jeremiah had delivered with such desperate hope, did not change the hearts of the people. Instead, it solidified their mockery. They did not hear the second lesson. They heard only the first. We are fragile. They did not hear the promise of a vessel of honor. They heard only the warning that the current vessel was marred and flawed. His reputation was sealed. He was not just unpopular. He was a public joke. As he walked through the markets, he heard the whispers. There goes the gloomy discourager. Here comes the prophet of pessimism. When a child dropped a clay pot and it shattered, a merchant would call out, "Quick, someone fetch Jeremiah. He must prophesy about the pot." They saw his message as one-sided, a constant drumbeat of negativity from a man who seemed to hate his own nation. But this was a terrible misunderstanding. His sadness, which was so evident to everyone, was not the pessimism of a man who had lost hope. It was the deep, profound grief of a man who saw exactly what was coming and loved the people it was coming for. This is what earned him his title, the Weeping Prophet. His sadness was not a weakness. It was not a flaw in his faith or a sign of a spiritual defect. In fact, his sadness was the very proof of his spiritual strength and maturity. It was an indication that his heart was perfectly aligned with God's own heart. He was a man who felt what God felt. He was grieved by the people's iniquity, by their stubbornness, by their relentless race toward a cliff. We must remember that Jeremiah was a priest. His call to be a prophet did not erase his first identity. He had been trained to stand in the gap, to intercede for the people, to carry their burdens before the Lord, and so he did. He lived in a state of agonizing internal conflict. As a prophet, he stood before the people and spoke for God, delivering messages of judgment. Then, as a priest, he would go before God and speak for the people, interceding, pleading, and weeping for the very people who had just mocked him. He literally wept for them, for their unrepentant attitude, for the terrible penalty that their sins required. His heart was broken by the spiritual state of his nation. He was a prophet of the Old Covenant, but God had given him the heart of the New Covenant. He cried over the city of Jerusalem, his tears a preview of the tears that the Messiah himself would one day shed over the same city. In this, Jeremiah was in good company. His profound grief was not a sign of failure, but a mark of his calling. The great messianic prophet Isaiah, in one of his most powerful prophecies, described the coming Savior not as a triumphant warrior, but as a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Yes, Isaiah was referring to the coming Christ, but Jeremiah was a living, breathing portrait of that very sorrow. He was a man who lived with the grief of God, a man who loved his enemies, a man who wept for those who persecuted him. His sadness was not a weakness, it was his message. It was the physical, emotional manifestation of God's own broken heart. The people saw him as a gloomy discourager, but they were wrong. He was a man of sorrows, and his tears were not tears of despair. They were the holy tears of a priest, weeping for the people he was born to save. While Jeremiah wept for his people, the world beyond Judah's borders was in turmoil, and the map of power was being redrawn. The old empires were crumbling. In the year 612 BC, the great power of Syria was defeated. A new dominant military power had risen, and it came from the east. It was the Babylonian Empire, and its ambition was as vast as the deserts its armies marched across. A new king, a man of ruthless efficiency and grand vision named Nebuchadnezzar, now sat on the throne of this empire. This was the shadow from the north. It was the distant storm cloud that Jeremiah had been warning about, and now it had a name. This changed the nature of Jeremiah's prophecy. His message was no longer a vague warning of an unnamed imminent disaster. It became sharp, specific, and terrifyingly political. He could no longer speak in parables of potters and fragile clay alone. He had to speak the name that God had given him. He had to warn Judah that this Babylonian army was not just another political rival. It was the chosen instrument of God's judgment. He went to the city gates and to the temple courts, his voice now filled with a new, cold certainty. "The disaster I have warned you about will come from this Babylonian army," he declared. He warned that they would come, that their siege engines would break down the walls, and that their king, Nebuchadnezzar, would show no mercy. He pleaded with the kings of Judah not to resist, to surrender and live, for this was the will of the Lord. The reaction was immediate and violent. Before, the people had called him a pessimist and a gloomy discourager. Now, they called him a traitor. The kings, the priests, and the false prophets who promised peace and victory accused him of speaking against his own people. To them, his message sounded like treason. He was undermining the morale of the soldiers. He was weakening the hands of the king. He was siding with the enemy. But Jeremiah could not be silent. He was not speaking his own words. He saw the political ambitions of Nebuchadnezzar, but he also saw the divine purpose behind them. The shadow from the north was real, and it was drawing closer with every act of defiance and every prayer to a lifeless idol that the people of Jerusalem committed. The weeping prophet now had to endure a new kind of isolation, the hatred reserved for one who speaks an unpopular and terrible truth. The isolation Jeremiah felt was almost suffocating. He was a man set apart, not just by his fellow priests in Anatot, but by the entire nation. He was the voice of doom in a city that craved hearing only good news. He felt utterly and completely alone, a single weeping man standing against a tide of corruption and denial, but he was not as alone as he felt. In this dark and chaotic period, God did not leave his people with only one voice. Other prophets were speaking in Judah, men who also carried the burden of the Lord's word. Among his contemporaries were Habakkuk and Zephaniah. Jeremiah would have heard their words echoing in the streets. He would have heard Habakkuk crying out in confusion, questioning God why he would use a wicked nation like Babylon to discipline his own covenant people. He would have heard Zephaniah's fiery warnings of the great day of the Lord, a day of wrath and trouble. Their messages were not identical to his, but they were harmonious. They were different facets of the same terrible, glorious truth. This brought Jeremiah a small, grim comfort. It was a validation that he was not mad. The unease, the sorrow, the divine warning, it was not a figment of his own gloomy imagination. Then, there was an even more impressive connection, a truth that must have strengthened Jeremiah's resolve immeasurably. Far away among the first group of captives who had been taken to Babylon in the first removal, there was another prophet. His name was Ezekiel. He was a priest, just like Jeremiah. And though he was prophesying in a foreign land, in captivity by the river Chebar, his message was shockingly similar. It was impressive that the substance of the messages proclaimed by Jeremiah and Ezekiel was similar, despite one prophesying in Palestine and the other in Babylon. Ezekiel, too, spoke of the fall of Jerusalem. He, too, warned that the temple's physical presence was no guarantee of safety. He, too, spoke of the nation's spiritual decay and the righteous judgment that was to come. This realization must have struck Jeremiah with divine force. God was not just speaking to him, God was speaking the same truth through many voices in many places. This knowledge did not make his burden any lighter, nor did it make the people's persecution any less painful, but it gave him the strength to continue. He was part of a chorus, even if he could not see the other singers. His resolve was hardened. He would continue to speak the word of the Lord no matter the cost, for he knew it was the truth. Strengthened by the knowledge that he was not alone, Jeremiah's ministry entered its most dangerous phase. He was no longer just a preacher in the temple courts. He became a direct challenger to the throne. His relationship with the rulers of Judah, which had been strained even under the good King Josiah, now deteriorated completely. He stood before the unjust kings who followed, men like Jehoiakim and Zedekiah, and he delivered his message without compromise. The courts of these last kings were places of desperate, arrogant denial. They were surrounded by false prophets who told them what they wanted to hear: that God would protect Jerusalem, that the temple was invincible, and that Babylon was a passing threat. Into this echo chamber of lies walked Jeremiah, his face etched with sorrow and his voice raw with authority. He stood before King Jehoiakim, a man who burned Jeremiah's written prophecies, and he warned him directly. He stood before King Zedekiah, the final, tragic king, and he pleaded with him. "Do not listen to the prophets who promise you peace," Jeremiah warned. "They are lying to you." His message was terribly specific. The only way to survive was to submit to the yoke of Babylon. These terrible predictions against Judah made him a profound enemy of the state. To the kings and their rulers, this was not prophecy, it was sedition. It was a political attack designed to break the will of the people and aid the enemy. As a result, Jeremiah was continually subjected to persecution, ridicule, and hostility from the very kings and rulers he was trying to save. They mocked him, they had him arrested, and they publicly shamed him. They could not stand the presence of a man who reflected their failures back at them. Jeremiah, in turn, watched them, his heart breaking. He saw their fear, their pride, their weak attempts to forge alliances with Egypt, and their complete inability to see the spiritual rot that was the true cause of their predicament. The conflict between the prophet and the kings was not just a political disagreement, it was a spiritual war. It was the heart of the new covenant, which Jeremiah carried, colliding with the hard, unrepentant heart of the old. The kings wanted a political solution to a spiritual problem. Jeremiah was telling them their problem was their soul, and their only hope was surrender. This was a message the kings could not and would not tolerate. His persecution was no longer just a matter of public ridicule. It was now a matter of state security. The constant hostility of the kings and their officials finally reached its breaking point. Jeremiah's warnings had become too specific, his presence too disruptive, and his predictions of defeat too unbearable for the ruling class. The persecution he had endured for so long was about to reach its most terrifying climax. Angry rulers, who saw him as a traitor demoralizing the army during a time of war, seized him. They did not just arrest him this time. They did not just put him in stocks for a few hours. They sought a more permanent and quieter solution. They took him to a cistern, an underground pit used to store water, but this one was empty of water. Instead, it was full of something else. He was thrown into a pit full of mud or mire. The shock of the fall took his breath away. He landed not on hard stone, but in a thick, cold mire. The darkness was absolute, a heavy blackness that seemed to have a weight of its own. He tried to stand, but the mud or mire pulled at his legs, a thick, heavy grip that sought to suck him down. The smell was overwhelming, filling his lungs and making his head swim. This was the lowest point of his life. He was completely, terrifyingly alone. He was buried beneath the city he had tried to save, left to fade away in the mire. In this cold, dark place, his spirit finally broke. The despair he had held back for so long, the grief he had carried for a nation, now turned inward. He was cold. He was hungry. He was isolated from every living human being. He cried out, but his voice was absorbed by the mud and the darkness. He called out to the God who had called him from before his birth. "Why?" he pleaded into the void. "Why did you call me? Why did you show me these things, only to leave me here?" This was not a lack of faith. It was the agony of faith being tested to its absolute limit. He was the weeping prophet, and now he wept for himself, for his own forsakenness, for a calling that had brought him nothing but pain. He sank deeper into the mud, the cold seeping into his bones. He felt himself weakening. This, he thought, was the end. This was the reward for his obedience. Yet even in that ultimate moment of despair, a tiny ember of the word he had carried for so long remained. The voice that spoke to him in Anatot had made a promise. "Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you and will rescue you." He was in the pit, in the mud, in the darkness. He was alone, but he clung to that single ancient promise, a thread of faith in a world of despair. Jeremiah did not perish in the pit. The promise held. A hand reached down into the darkness, a rope was lowered, and he was pulled out of the mire. He was weak, covered in filth, and haunted by the experience, but he was alive. His rescue was a bitter validation. His enemies had failed to silence him, and his God had proven faithful once more, even in the depths. His spirit, though battered, was not broken. It was forged anew in that dark, cold place. The experience had stripped him of any remaining fear of man. What more could they do to him? He had been to the bottom, and God had been there with him. His work was not finished, but he knew his words were fleeting. The king had burned his scrolls before. The rulers could throw his body in a pit. He needed a way to make the word of God permanent, a record that would outlast the kings, outlast the city, and outsit a record for future generations. It was in this moment that his most important human relationship came into focus. He was not entirely alone. He had a loyal companion, his secretary, Baruch. Baruch was more than a scribe. He was a steadfast, faithful friend. In a city of mockers and persecutors, Baruch was a believer. He saw the divine truth in Jeremiah's sorrowful eyes and was not afraid to stand with him. This partnership became Jeremiah's new ministry. He was often in hiding, his life in constant danger. So, he and Baruch would meet in secret. Jeremiah, his voice perhaps still hoarse, would speak the prophecies that God gave him, the warnings, the judgments, and the surprising, beautiful promises of a future restoration. And Baruch, with faithful, steady hands, would sit and write. He faithfully wrote down all the prophecies, word for word, creating a record of the divine message. This act of writing was an act of profound resilience. It was an act of defiance against the kings and the rulers who wanted to silence the prophet. They could persecute Jeremiah's body, but they could not stop the word he carried. By writing it down, Baruch and Jeremiah were ensuring that the message would live on. This scroll, this collection of warnings and hopes, would become the book of Jeremiah. It was a testament to one man's unwavering commitment to his calling, and another man's loyal friendship in the face of impossible odds. The shadow from the north, which Jeremiah had warned about for so many years, was no longer a shadow. It was a reality. In the year 604 BC, the armies of Babylon, led by the powerful Nebuchadnezzar, arrived at the gates of Jerusalem. The city, which had lived in a state of defiant denial, was suddenly paralyzed by a fear it had refused to acknowledge. The warnings that had been dismissed as the ramblings of a gloomy discourager now echoed in the streets with the terrifying ring of truth. The people looked at Jeremiah, and for the first time they saw not a traitor, but a prophet. But it was too late to change their fate, only to endure it. This was not the final, complete destruction that Jeremiah knew was to come. It was, instead, a terrible warning shot, a divine rap on the door of a nation that had locked itself inside with its idols. Nebuchadnezzar's army partially destroyed parts of the city, a surgical and pointed display of their power. They did not tear down the temple, not yet. They did not level the walls. Instead, they did something that was, in some ways, more psychologically devastating. They took captives. This was the first part of the three main removals. The Babylonian soldiers, acting on precise orders, went through the city and took the best and the brightest. They took the young, intelligent sons of the nobility. They took the skilled craftsmen. They took the future of Judah, including men like Daniel and his companions, and led them away in chains toward Babylon. Jeremiah watched this happen, and his heart was utterly broken. This was his validation, and it was a torment to behold. To be right, and for right to look like this, was the heaviest burden of all. He felt no vindication, only a profound, weeping sorrow. He watched as mothers wailed, as families were torn apart, and as a generation of his people was led into exile, just as he had said they would be. The people were terrified, but their leadership remained stubborn. The arrogant King Jehoiakim, who had sat in his winter palace and burned Jeremiah's scroll, was still on the throne. He viewed this invasion not as a final judgment, but as a political setback. He was humbled, but he was not repentant. The nation was gripped by fear, but it was not moved to change. They were sorry they had been caught, but they were not sorry for the spiritual neglect that had invited this disaster. Jeremiah's role in this was agonizing. The very rulers who had persecuted him now looked to him with a mixture of fear and resentment. He was the man who had been right. His prophecy had come true, and the first stage of the nation's fall had begun. He continued to preach, his voice now heavy with the authority of fulfilled prophecy. He warned them that this was only the beginning. He told them that the potter was not finished with the flawed clay. This was not the final breaking, but the first squeeze. He pleaded with them, even now, to soften their hearts, to surrender to the will of God, to accept the discipline, but they would not. They stiffened their necks, and in doing so, they sealed their fate for the final, terrible siege that was to come. The nation of Judah did not learn its lesson from the first invasion. The terror of 604 BC faded, replaced by a bitter, resentful, and foolish pride. The reign of King Jehoiakim was followed by the short, evil reign of his son, Jehoiachin. His defiance was so immediate and so total that Nebuchadnezzar's patience, which was already thin, snapped. The Babylonian army returned just 3 months into his reign. In the year 597 BC, the second great removal occurred. This time, the Babylonians took King Jehoiachin himself, along with his entire court, his officers, and thousands more of the leading citizens and skilled workers. Among this group of exiles was the priest who would become a great prophet in his own right, Ezekiel. This left Jerusalem a hollowed-out, weakened city, a ghost of its former self. Nebuchadnezzar, in a political move, then placed the former king's uncle Mattaniah on the throne as a puppet. He changed his name to Zedekiah and made him swear a solemn oath of loyalty to Babylon. Zedekiah was the last king of Judah. He was not a strong man. He was not decisively evil like his predecessors, but he was weak, pliable, and terrified. His reign was a long, slow tragedy of indecision. He was caught between two impossible forces. On one side was Jeremiah, the weeping prophet, who came to him with the consistent, terrifying, and divinely appointed message from God: be loyal to your oath, serve the king of Babylon. Do not resist. If you surrender, you and your house will live. This was a message of political submission, but it was Judah's only path to survival. On the other side were the arrogant, nationalistic officials and false prophets still in Jerusalem. They despised Jeremiah. They told the king that God would never let his holy city fall. They whispered in his ear that Egypt, the great power to the south, would come and save them. They urged him to rebel, to break his oath, to fight. Zedekiah was a man torn in two. He was afraid of his own officials, and he was afraid of the Babylonians. He would secretly send for Jeremiah, hiding him in the palace, and he would ask in a desperate whisper, "Is there any word from the Lord?" And Jeremiah, with a heart breaking for this weak and doomed king, would give the same terrible answer, "Yes, you will be handed over to the king of Babylon." Zedekiah, too afraid to obey the word of God and too afraid to defy his own court, tried to do both. He listened to his officials. He broke his sacred oath. He made an alliance with Egypt and rebelled against Babylon. The patience of Nebuchadnezzar had now, finally, ended. This was not a warning. This was not a partial discipline. This was the end. Around the year 586 BC, the full, terrifying might of the Babylonian army returned to Jerusalem. But this time, they did not come for a partial removal. They came for total annihilation. The final siege began. The massive, unconquerable army of Babylon surrounded the city, and the great gates of Jerusalem were shut tight. The siege was not a battle of arrows and spears. It was a battle of time. The Babylonians built walls around the city walls. They cut off every supply line, and they waited. Inside the city, the days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into agonizing months. The storehouses of grain ran empty. The city began to starve. Jeremiah was there for all of it. He was not spared the suffering. He walked the streets and saw the horror he had spent 40 years of his life trying to prevent. He saw mothers who were too weak to feed their children. He saw the proud soldiers on the walls grow thin and gaunt. He saw hope die, replaced first by hunger and then by a cold, hollow despair. The city was a tomb. The air was thick with the silence of suffering. And all the while, the Babylonian army sat outside, watching, waiting for the proud, starving city to collapse. The final siege dragged on for a long, terrible time, but the end was inevitable. The city, completely weakened by starvation and despair, could no longer defend itself. The walls of Jerusalem were finally breached. The Babylonian forces poured into the city. The sounds of collapse and sorrow echoed through the streets as the last vestiges of resistance crumbled. The city fell. This was not a clean or political victory. It was the climax of 40 years of warnings. It was the judgment that Jeremiah had wept over for his entire adult life. King Zedekiah, in a final act of cowardice, tried to flee in the night, but he was captured. His fate was a terrible one, a final dark punctuation on the era of the kings. But the true ultimate tragedy was what happened next. The Babylonian soldiers, acting on orders from Nebuchadnezzar, marched to the temple. This was the Temple of Solomon, the building that had been the center of Israel's faith for generations. It was the place where the people believed God himself dwelled. It was the very building the false prophets had pointed to, saying, "God will never let this place fall." They had trusted in the building more than the God who was meant to inhabit it. The soldiers brought fire. They set the great wooden doors and carved beams ablaze. The fire caught, and it roared. The temple, the most holy place in all of Judah, was consumed by flames. Jeremiah, a witness to this ultimate catastrophe, watched as the symbol of God's presence, the symbol of the covenant, was burned and destroyed. The sky over the city turned black with smoke and red with the reflection of the flames. The heat was immense. the sound of a nation's heart being ripped out. This was the ultimate consequence of their spiritual neglect. Their false hope had been in the stone and the gold, and now it was all being reduced to ash. The fire spread, the palaces of the king were burned, the homes of the nobles were burned. The entire city of Jerusalem, the great city, was burned to the ground, and its walls were torn down. It was a complete and total destruction. As Jeremiah stood amidst the ruins, his feet covered in the ashes of the city he loved, he must have felt an emptiness, a grief too profound for tears. Everything he had warned them about had happened. Every terrible prophecy had come true. The potter had taken the marred vessel, and because it had refused to be molded, because it had remained hard and stubborn, it had been shattered. The smoke rising from the ruins of the temple was the final terrible evidence. The city was gone. The kingdom was gone. The people were either gone or were being rounded up for the third and final removal. A long, sad procession of a broken people walking away from a smoking ruin toward the rivers of Babylon, where they would sit and weep. In the immediate, chaotic aftermath of Jerusalem's fall, a strange and deeply ironic event took place. The city was a smoking ruin, filled with the sounds of sorrow and the commands of victorious soldiers. The remaining populace, the starving survivors, were being rounded up. The officials and nobles who had persecuted Jeremiah were now facing the harsh judgment of the conquering army. In the midst of this complete desolation, Babylonian soldiers were moving through the rubble with a specific and unusual mission. They were looking for Jeremiah. The prophet, covered in the dust and ash of his fallen city, his heart a hollow void of grief, was found. He was not treated as a captured enemy. He was not thrown into chains with the others. Instead, he was brought before the captain of the invading army, a man named Nebuzaradan. This captain, a high-ranking official in Nebuchadnezzar's court, treated Jeremiah not with contempt, but with respect. A message had come from the king of Babylon himself. Nebuchadnezzar, the most powerful man in the world, the shadow from the north, had heard of this strange prophet in Judah. He had been told that for years, Jeremiah had been warning the Judean kings of Babylon's rise. He knew that Jeremiah had advised King Zedekiah to surrender, to honor his oath. The very message that had branded Jeremiah a traitor in his own land had marked him as a man of wisdom, or at least a man of use, in the eyes of the conqueror. The orders from Nebuchadnezzar were clear: do not harm him, find him, and look after him. As the source states, Jeremiah was duly protected. The Babylonian captain presented Jeremiah with a choice. He was given his freedom. He was offered freedom and provisions. He could go to Babylon with the exiles, where he would be honored and cared for. Or he could stay in the ruined land of Judah with the few poor farmers and vine dressers who were being left behind. This was the most bitter validation of his entire life. His own people, the kings of Judah, the priests, and the officials, had rejected his message. They had mocked him, mistreated him, and thrown him into a pit of mud to fade away. Now, the pagan invading army, the very instrument of God's judgment, was the one to recognize his divine message. He was saved by the enemy he had predicted. He was given provisions by the army that had just starved his people. The irony was crushing. This freedom must have felt like a new kind of prison. He was free, but his nation was in chains. He was respected by the conqueror, but he had been despised by his own. He was a prophet who was right, and his reward was to stand alone on the ashes of his home, protected by the very fire he had warned was coming. He chose to stay. He cast his lot not with the victorious conquerors in Babylon, but with the broken remnant, the poorest of the poor, left behind in a land that was no longer a kingdom, but just a desolate, conquered province. Jeremiah's decision to stay in the ruined land of Judah was a testament to his priestly heart. His work, he must have felt, was to remain with the remnant, the small, impoverished community of survivors left to tend the fields. A new Babylonian governor, Gedaliah, was appointed. He was a good man, and for a brief, fragile moment, it seemed that a new, humble life could be built from the ashes. But the cycle of violence and disobedience was not finished. A small group of Judean soldiers who had been hiding in the countryside saw this new peace as collaboration. Driven by a misplaced and tragic sense of national pride, they came and, against all reason, the governor Gedaliah lost his life. This single act of violence plunged the remnant into a new panic. They had just seen what the Babylonian army did to a rebellious city. Now, they had done the unthinkable. They had harmed the king's appointed governor. They were terrified, certain that Nebuchadnezzar would return, and that this time his reprisal would be absolute. They believed there was no hope left for them in Judah. In their terror, they decided on a course of action. They would flee, and they decided to flee to the one place that had been a symbol of false hope for generations: Egypt. It was the very nation God had repeatedly warned them not to trust, the broken reed that had failed to save them from Babylon. This frightened, leaderless remnant then came to Jeremiah. They had not listened to him for 40 years, but now, in their desperation, they put on a show of piety. They came to him, weeping, and said, "Pray to the Lord your God for us. Pray for this entire remnant. We are all that is left. Whatever the Lord your God tells you, we will do. We promise, whether it is good or bad, we will obey." Jeremiah, his heart weary, agreed. He prayed for them, and after 10 days the word of the Lord came, and it was clear, and it was a promise. "Do not be afraid," the Lord said. "Stay in this land. If you stay, I will build you up and not tear you down. I will plant you and not uproot you. Do not go to Egypt." The message was a direct test of their faith. Jeremiah delivered the message, and the moment he spoke it, the people's faces hardened. They had not been asking for guidance. They had been asking for permission for what they already intended to do. The very leaders who had promised to obey now turned on him. "You are lying," they said. "The Lord our God has not sent you to say, 'Do not go to Egypt.' Baruch, your secretary, has turned you against us to hand us over to the Babylonians." In a final, tragic, and defining act of disobedience, the remnant of Judah rejected the word of God. They gathered their families, and they fled to Egypt. And in their arrogant defiance, they committed one last act of cruelty. They forced Jeremiah the weeping prophet and his loyal secretary Baruch to go with them. They were taken against his will. They also forced the daughters of King Zedekiah, who had been left in Jeremiah's care, to go as well. The prophet who had spent his life warning Judah not to trust in Egypt was now a captive, dragged to that very land by the last rebellious fragment of his own people. His ministry in his homeland was over, but his work was not. Even in the land of Egypt, in the city of Daphne, the old weary prophet continued to speak, warning this final, doomed remnant that the judgment of God would find them even there. They did not listen. The final, clear record of Jeremiah's life ends in the land of Egypt. After being dragged there against his will, he delivered his last fiery prophecies. He stood before the rebellious remnant in the city of Daphne and warned them that their idolatry, the very sin that had destroyed Jerusalem, would destroy them here as well. He warned them that Nebuchadnezzar's judgment would reach even to the banks of the Nile. The book of Jeremiah, the faithful record kept by Baruch, chronicles these warnings, and then it simply stops. His final fate is not clearly recorded in the Bible. This silence is, in itself, a powerful statement. Jeremiah's life was never about him. It was not about his comfort, his happiness, or his personal legacy. His life was a vessel for the Word of God. His purpose was the message, not the man. And when that message had been delivered, when the final warning had been given to the last remnant, his story in the Holy Scriptures concludes. He was a voice, and having spoken, he disappears from the biblical narrative. But tradition, held for centuries, tried to fill in the silence. Ancient historians, passed down through generations, claim that Jeremiah's life did not end in peace. Many claim that Jeremiah met a violent end in Egypt. This is the ultimate tragic and profound irony of his entire life. Who would do such a thing? The tradition holds that it was not the Babylonians who had protected him. It was not the kings of Judah who had only imprisoned him. It was, the stories claim, some Hebrews in revolt in the city of Daphne. If this tradition is true, it means that the weeping prophet, the man who had survived the hostility of kings, the despair of the pit, and the fall of a nation, met his end at the hands of the very last fragment of the people he had spent his entire life weeping for. He was the man of sorrows, and his final act was to be rejected by the people he refused to abandon. However, the source is clear and must be respected. The Holy Scriptures do not affirm anything about this end for the man of God. His end remains a mystery, shrouded in the mists of history. Perhaps this is more fitting. It detaches the man from the eternal power of his message. His fame, however, endured. Long after his disappearance, there were beliefs among the Jews that he had not truly perished, that he might one day return, a testament to the powerful mark his sorrowful and resilient life had left on the heart of his nation. His end, whether in the quiet of old age or in a final, difficult event, was the conclusion of a life lived in total, painful, and beautiful obedience. As we conclude our journey through the life of the prophet Jeremiah, it is easy to see him, as the source text describes, as a gloomy discourager with a pessimistic prophetic message. His life was defined by sorrow, persecution, and the tragic fulfillment of his own terrible warnings. We remember him as the weeping prophet, the man who watched his nation crumble to ash. But to see only this is a one-sided impression that is not based on the entire content of the book. Jeremiah's message, the one that God had placed in his mouth before he was even born, was not just one of destruction. It was also one of profound, remarkable, and joyful prophecies of mercy, deliverance, and abundant life for all. He was the potter's prophet, and he knew better than anyone that the potter does not break the clay just to discard it. He breaks it to remake it. Hidden within his warnings of judgment was the most beautiful promise in the Old Testament. Jeremiah was a prophet of the Old Covenant, but God gave him the heart of the New Covenant. He was the one who prophesied a time when the old system of laws and rituals would be made new. He predicted a time when the Messiah would return, a time when God would abolish human suffering, wars, and misery. Through Jeremiah, God revealed the way to a change of heart. He spoke of a new covenant, one different from the one made with their fathers. He prophesied a day when God would put his law not on stone tablets, but in their minds, and write it on their hearts. A day when they would all know the Lord, from the least to the greatest, and their sins would be forgiven and remembered no more. This was Jeremiah's true legacy. His life was the painful embodiment of the breaking. He had to tear down, uproot, destroy, and overthrow. But his words were the seeds of the planting and building that was to come. His unwavering commitment to his calling, his resilience in the face of adversity, and the powerful messages of both judgment and hope serve as a beacon for us all. The lessons from Jeremiah's life are not about the gloom of destruction. They are about the faithfulness of a God who will not give up on his people. They are about the hope that remains even after the fire. And they are about the promise of a new heart, a promise that a God of love is always, always in the business of making vessels of honor. May the lessons from Jeremiah's life, his sorrow and his hope, continue to resonate, guiding us on our own journeys of faith. As we conclude our journey through the life of Jeremiah, I wanted to share some personal reflections on this incredible and tragic figure. When we began this story, it was easy to think of Jeremiah as a one-dimensional character, simply a gloomy discourager or a pessimist. But I believe this is a profound misunderstanding. What I found in his story was not a man who enjoyed predicting doom, but a man who was so deeply in love with his people that their path of self-destruction caused him a lifetime of agonizing grief. His sadness was not his weakness, it was his greatest strength. It was the very proof of his spiritual maturity and his connection to the heart of God. He was a priest who could not stop interceding, a prophet who could not be silent, and a man who was, in the end, utterly, heartbreakingly human. His resilience is almost unbelievable. After being ridiculed for 40 years, after being thrown into a pit of mud, after watching his city burn to the ground, he still did not abandon his people. He chose to stay with the broken remnant, and he was even dragged to Egypt against his will, still prophesying to them. The most meaningful lesson for me, and perhaps for all of us, comes from the house of the potter. This analogy is so powerful. We are the clay. And the story gives us two lessons from this. First, we must understand our own fragility. We are fragile. We live in times of moral relativism where, as the story said, everyone does what they want, and this often leads to anguish because we need parameters. But the second lesson is the one filled with so much hope. We must trust in the faithfulness of the potter. God's specialty is not in discarding what is flawed, but in making and remaking, in creating vessels of honor. So here is the thought I would like to leave with you. We all go through times of reshaping. We all face trials, difficulties, and periods of loss that feel like they are crushing us. The story of Jeremiah asks us a question. In those moments, will we be hard clay or soft clay? If we are hard clay, if we become stubborn, bitter, angry, or proud, we resist the potter's hands. And hard clay, when pressed, can only shatter. But if we can be soft clay, if we can remain humble, teachable, and trusting, even in our pain, then we are not being shattered. We are being molded. We are being reshaped. Jeremiah's entire life was a message that the breaking is not always the end. For him, the destruction of Jerusalem was the necessary, painful first step toward the promise of a new covenant. His life teaches us that even in the most profound darkness, even when it looks like the entire city has burned, there is always a promise of mercy, restoration, and a new beginning. If this story touched your heart, please give this video a like. It helps the light reach others who may need it. Share your thoughts and reflections in the comments below. I would love to hear what part spoke to you most. And if you wish to continue this journey of quiet stories, faith, and healing, subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next chapter. May the light stay with you, always.